Welcome back to another episode of The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Jeff Reimer, Associate Editor of Comment, and I'm here with your regular host, Ann Snyder. I've commandeered the driver's seat because I have a question for you, Ann. It's very personal. Are you ready to dish?
Uh-oh. I'm going to try. Do my best. I think you're safe, Jeff, I think.
Okay. So there used to be this funny blog on Tumblr called Mary is My Home Girl. It's long defunct, but so today we're going to be talking a lot about natality and mothering and birth and the Virgin Mary. So before we get into that, I want to know, your listeners have a right to know, who are your saintly home girls?
Oof.
Who are your godly girlfriends of the Christian past?
Okay. Ooh, that's a good one. So I'm going to just start out by risking some offense for probably a bunch of our really holy people, holy audience members. I'm not a big fan of Saint Therese de Lisieux. Just going to say that, and we can have a longer conversation about why that is. I think I need to mature spiritually to fully absorb what she's talking about when she speaks what I find are very inane sentences about love. I just find her very passive, and I mourn that she died really young. And I'm not trying to be sacrilegious, but I just have struggled with her. So I'm just going to say that up front. I'm not super orthodox in that way. I have just really loved the more sort of relatable people. So Dorothy Day is the first person I think about. I didn't really have a hero until age 27 or 28 that I could name, like when they ask you who your hero is in class or in life. And I discovered the long loneliness when I was late 20s, and the combination of her life pre-conversion, which was not my life in terms of its rambunctiousness and promiscuity and sort of bohemian. She was in this bohemian, writerly communist world in New York City, pre-Depression, Great Depression. That was not my same life, but I did identify with her tenor for sort of passionate care for the world and both its pain and beauty, and then how she wound up consecrating that when she did become a Christian, and more specifically became Catholic upon the birth of her daughter. And so I just specifically love the way she wound up praying for and then receiving a vocation to integrate her writerly gifts with embodied community building in these homes of hospitality, originally in New York, and then became the Catholic worker movement. And that deeply inspired my journalism. So she's really the main hero.
Yeah, she has a sort of sanctified radicalism.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. And then the only other person, which I'll just say briefly, and I think Margarita's listening in here, so I'll say this in front of her, but this is genuine. Edith Stein has given me just very helpful language to understand the impulse towards maternity in public. And I don't have children of my own, but I think somehow her words almost on like the feminine soul and what it kind of how it is to be this like protective canopy for other souls has just always really resonated with me and given me a category or a set of categories that are both aspirational in my own vocational leadership, as well as, I think she highlights like this unique, I think both men and women experience pain in their gender in all the different ways we each live out, being male, female, but, she has given me words to describe like the power of pain and vulnerability that works itself out sometimes in extremely intimate private life and then also sometimes in public. And how do you do that in the 21st century? She was writing right before and during World War II. But so Dorothy Day and Edith Stein.
Do you have like one book or piece of writing by Stein that you would recommend?
Her essays on women. I don't love all of them. You can't be chronologically arrogant when you read them. Like they're definitely written in like the 30s and early 40s, 20s, 30s. But it's a compilation of essays called Essays on Woman that I turn to over and over again.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. I'm delighted to have this particular podcast shifting a bit from focus on the masculine and male friendship and the state of men today to, we're just covering huge universal bases here in 2 or 3 weeks now, moving to the feminine. And we have some wonderful interlocutors to join us today. I want to welcome Jennifer Banks and Margarita Mooney Clayton. I'm just so happy to see both of you listeners. We have a real treat in store. I think the last couple episodes, as I said, we focused on sort of how society seems to be straitjacketing male flourishing, at least in the U.S., North America in more recent years. But it should also be said that when it comes to the default assumptions of our public life, the categories we emphasize in our democracy, and oftentimes, this is of interest to comment readers, the voice promoted by the quote church, all of this sometimes seems to overlook, if not actively shut out, insights that come from experiences of motherhood, including the very capacity to be a mother. These are intuitions and assumptions that, in my observation and experience, tend towards hope, towards the possibility of birth and beginning again, that tend towards a posture of receiving, towards a lens that views agency as more holistically wrapped up in the gift logic, less sort of meritocratic control or self-making. So we're going to talk about these subtleties today at levels both earthy and more philosophical, and we really couldn't have asked for two better conversation partners. Jennifer Banks and Margarita Mooney Clayton are deep thinkers, both of them. Margarita as an author, community builder, and associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, as well as the founder of the Scala Foundation. And Jennifer Banks is senior executive editor for Religion and the Humanities at Yale University Press. Margarita has written a piece in this latest issue of Comment provocatively titled, quote, "The Marian Gift of Dependence, a challenge to the masculine impulses of liberalism." And Jennifer, who has also written stirringly for Comment in an earlier issue, has most recently come out with a showstopper of a book titled Natality, Towards a Philosophy of Birth, published in May of this year. Both of them toil at the intersection of the social sciences, philosophy, and the personal. And both of them, in my experience, are uniquely visionary weavers of the curious who, with them, long to integrate their lived, embodied experience with the timeless questions of our humanity. So, Margarita, Jennifer, thank you so much for bearing with us, and just a privilege to have you with us. Thanks for enriching Comment and joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I would just love to start out with perhaps a broad funnel, and then we'll narrow in on both each of your work and how I think they intersect in very timely ways with big questions a lot of us are asking about our politics, our society, but also just relations with our neighbor and fellow man and woman, you could say. I'm wondering, when each of you hear this phrase, a feminine logic, or even a feminine genius, as my hero Edith Stein often talks about, what, if anything, immediately comes to mind?
Well, I would say openness to mystery. And I'll elaborate this with, in relationship to my article as we continue to talk. But I would actually also say openness to mystery. And what I really like is the term kind of feminine wisdom. Not just feminine genius, but a kind of wisdom that has both certainty, but also a receptivity and a hopeful expectation. That's what I think of the feminine wisdom, is a certainty along with an openness to the mysterious action of God in the world.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think for me, what comes to mind also is hospitality. I'm when I think of the feminine, I try not to think so much in abstractions. I think of the women I have known. I think of the authors I have published at Yale Press. I think about the proposals I get from women, the books I have read, my encounters with other women in the world. And what I do find is that, I think through a lot of history, women were the ones who had to kind of deal with the details of feeding, caring, of connecting. And the way they were able to do that was by practicing a pretty radical hospitality, of course, not in all situations, but accommodating. And so, I think of this in terms of to the degree that there is a difference in the kinds of books I get from male and women, and it's not a clear binary at all. But I think there's less in some of the women's work that I published, less a sense of, it's all about kind of winning the argument, and a little bit more about how do I integrate and accommodate these different perspectives and develop a sort of broad and inclusive vision in a world that, deals with other people.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. So your book, Natality, the subtitle is Toward a Philosophy of Birth. So when you say natality, you're not just talking about physical birth, but you're not talking about it either. That's the impression I get. Is that right? How would you define natality as you're using it?
Yeah, so if birth is the event of being born, natality is the ways we are subject to that event, the ways that event shapes who we are as creatures. And so in that way, it's the same thing really as mortality, except with birth as the center of that concept. So yes, it's very much about the experience, the kind of physical experience that's located in a specific place in a specific time, but also about that as a kind of ongoing part of the human story. So about how we think about that and engage with it. And I think that at least in our culture at this moment, we tend to think of birth as more of a discrete event, not so much something that we think about and reflect on. So that's what I was trying to kind of bring to the fore.
Yeah, that contrast with mortality is very helpful. So when we think about natality, we're contemplating our natality in the same way we contemplate our mortality.
Yeah, and mortality needs no definition, of course.
Right.
We know what that means, and yet it's very hard for people to make that jump to natality. Even after you've said that to them, there's this sense of, oh, this is really complicated or confusing or somehow very abstract. But I don't think people would ever say those things about mortality. We know what mortality is.
Yeah. Yeah. To actually Margarita's initial definition about even the feminine or initial sort of characteristics, the natality is shrouded in so much mystery. I think partly because very few of us really, really remember consciously anything about our own births. And for many other reasons. Jennifer, as I understand it, when you just started down the tunnel, you could say, or rich meadow, whatever the metaphor is, of thinking about natality and birth that has led to this book, I understand the prompt initially was deeply personal, sort of partly in the context of having your first child and the earth-shattering event that was, as you describe it. As you started really delving into it, and with specific reference to Hannah Arendt's use of the word, how did your sort of conception of its application and implications broaden out? And was that surprising to you that this actually, if we actually had this as a little bit more of a category, a word in our public lexicon, in the study of philosophy as a way to perhaps even think about our politics, so on and so on. I just love for you to talk about like the widening from the deeply intimate personal experience of natality to seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, it has so many implications, and in many ways that project of beginning to explore what those are, I think has just begun. Obviously, this is something that's been going on. People have been thinking about birth for millennia, but in terms of us sort of consciously having that be a part of our intellectual culture, part of our traditions, part of our education. In many ways, the book was shaped by me being at a major university and being in a role where I was not just developing my own arguments or refining my own spiritual understandings of birth, but actually trying to think about, where is birth in all of these proposals I'm getting? Where is this fundamental part of the condition in this much broader context. And the book, I think, really became a book about human plurality, which is, the experience of birth is about being in relation and how we think about and deal with our connections with other people. And to think about how birth is kind of a part of all these different traditions. So that was part of the challenge. And I had to kind of narrow it in some ways. And the book ultimately became a book focused on kind of the modern West over the last couple of centuries. So I had earlier versions that had gone into more of the biblical material, a lot of the work from antiquity, but it became very unwieldy. There was too much. And so it became a book about the world we're in and the place of birth within that world, not exclusively in Christian contexts, not exclusively as a theological concept, as it wasn't for Arendt, although it was for Augustine, who she really drew the concept from. And I think this is hard. I think it's hard because when we come to birth, there are so many ways that our concepts divide us. It's probably the most divisive issue in our public life today.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to get beyond those and to think about it as a kind of plural reality, which is what I was trying to do in the book.
Yeah. You're right at this very surprise fracture, set of radioactive fractures. Yeah. Well, we'll get back to all things natality. But part of our vision, Jeff's and my vision for this, or why we were excited to invite you two on together, was, at least in our heads, some relation between this beautiful piece that Margarita wrote for us around kind of a Marian logic, and the Marian gift to the church, quote unquote. And I think, obviously, I think, Margarita, you actually say in the piece that of all sort of paintings, at least in sort of, I think, probably Western Christian art, they're the most common are Enunciation paintings. So birth and expectancy of birth is very wrapped up in Mary. So I want to, ask you, you talk about dependence specifically as this gift, this Marian gift to the church, and or sort of this posture that the church is to take and inhabit. Could you flesh that out a little bit for those who haven't read your piece, or especially, I would say, for Protestants listening, or even the secular listener who only thinks of Mary perhaps in this cultural, far away, maybe superstitious way?
Yeah. So I chose to begin my piece and comment focusing on the Enunciation, in part because, as you said, there's so much artistic depiction of this across all of Christianity, but also because I struggled, and I know a lot of women struggle with this idea that motherhood is something that makes you fundamentally, that you have this dependent child on you, and you have to give up your autonomy. And so what I wanted to challenge readers to do was to put themselves in the place of some of the early Christians, and what was the meaning of the Enunciation, and why would it be painted so much? And why would the Virgin Mary at the moment of the conception of Jesus be painted so much? And what does this mean to our modern understandings of dependence and motherhood? And what I say in the article, or what I'm trying to express in the article, is that the traditional understanding of the Enunciation was that Mary is receptive. She's accepting of God's will for her. And because she renounces the fundamental original sin of autonomy and accepts her dependence on God, that opens the way for our salvation by restoring our relationship to God through the incarnation. God becoming in the womb of Mary, becoming a human being who kept his divine nature, but also becomes a human and enters into the world. So Mary's repairing the rift through her biological motherhood, but also through the free use of her will to accept her dependence upon God to determine her life, not without her cooperation. She had to say yes, right? That's what's happening at the Enunciation. She could have said no. And what I develop in the article is that looking at this Marian dependence, and what thinking through the meaning of the biological gift of motherhood, right? What Mary is doing is a complete gift of self. The way the early church understood this was that Mary made her entire self, body and soul, available to God. Literally, the God bearer, the Theotokos, she becomes the mother of God. She bears God in her womb. And that is the image of what we're called to be as the body of Christ in the church. Whereas so often, a lot of the discourse that I hear in the church is that we need to be doing things. We need to be active. And of course, there is a place for that. But what the Marian gift of dependence reminds us is that without continuously returning back to our origin, to God, our creator, our activism may not actually be what God is asking us to do, but what we want to do, right? And so that's not that the church isn't called to be and act like an association in the world and engaging in acts of charity, but that can never be separated from the fundamental call of the church to be a home and to be a place of prayer and hospitality where, just as in Mary's womb, between the Enunciation and the Nativity was 9 months of gestation. And the church has to provide the place for contemplation and prayer and reflection before we can discern and know how God is calling us to act in the world. So remembering the femininity and motherhood of Mary reminds us that we have to enter into God's time, lest we reduce God to an instrument of power or achievement. And so by recalling this affective, feminine dimension of the church, that surrender and dependence on God, we can avoid falling into a kind of activist, masculine mentality.
So now that we've kind of heard from both of you on what it is you've been writing and thinking about, I want to see how these can kind of probe the boundaries between these two concepts: natality on one hand and dependence on there. Where do they overlap, and where might they differ?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Margarita said resonated with me, because I think that there is in birth both active aspects and passive aspects. So birth is in some ways, what could we do that's a greater indicator of human creative power, to have this other person emerge from you is incredibly powerful. But of course, we don't control it as much as we think we do. And there is a lot that I think in the experience of trying to conceive, of being pregnant, having a child, you're not on, your time. Like you said, it's God's time. It's I think still frustrating to people because we have been trained in many ways to think that we are in control of our environments, and that there is this radical dependency that's a part of it for the child, but also, for a mother, for really everyone who's involved. It's not, it's an indication of the ways that we are dependent, not just on mothers, but also on our communities, on our material conditions, our social conditions, our gods, that we are in many ways very small, a very small piece of creation. I think that's in line with what Margarita has said. I think one thing, to emphasize is that in my own thinking, I think these aren't entirely feminine qualities. I think they can be. But of course, men were all born too. So birth is partly a reminder of male dependency too.
Yeah, I would say that for me, and the more I research on Mary and the titles of Mary as Mother of God, Mother of the Church, Mother of Christ, the more it just comes to me that what is significant is to remember and to remind people is that creation is a gift, and that there is a human aspect to birth and dependence, but there's a supernatural aspect to it as well. And that we are all born of mothers, but we're also all born of God, because ultimately Mary is calling us back to this acknowledgement of this fundamental dependence we all have on God for our origin. And that a lot of Marian art and Marian theology is also about this dependence and this self-gift also being a source of hope for the redemption of humanity, to return back to the Father, to come home to our eternal place, right? What I think is so interesting is that there is this very real, natural thing that everybody can acknowledge, whether they call themselves a Christian or not, which is the body of a pregnant woman, the conception, birth. But in Christianity, there's also an understanding that there is that human birth can help us to understand the supernatural origin and destiny of the human person. And that's what I'm trying to call people back to, is both a kind of reverence for the natural, but also how that natural is pointing us to a supernatural origin and destiny that we share.
One of the things that sprang to my mind, Jennifer, when you were talking, is that these active and passive aspects of birth. You know, when my wife was going to have her first baby, we went to this birthing class, and it was the narrative around this birthing class was like, we are taking back control over birth. So this is very active kind of thing. But in doing that, we are submitting to the natural processes of the body and birth, which is actively seizing this passive process back from sort of this medicalized interventionist practice and making birth again something that we undergo. And that's an empowering thing for the mothers, not as passive as it would seem. So that's just my observation as the male observer in the room.
It's very legitimate.
So Margarita, you say that kind of this dependence is an integrative force, like kind of bringing together immateriality and sort of our physical sort of natality. Would you say, Jennifer, that that's also what you're describing in natality, that it's a reminder of us that we are unified in our souls, in our bodies, and that natality is a call back to that?
I think so. I think I don't articulate it in Marian language, and not exclusively in Christian language. And this, again, is just, this has been my path, has been working with Buddhist scholars and Sufi scholars and people across all these different traditions who write about a lot of these things with slightly different emphasis, but with great depth and enormous insight. And I'm married to a Hindu, so this has been part of my own life path, is trying to think about, my own Catholic understanding of this growing up, and also how that is not an exclusive angle, that angle is a way of, again, kind of opening up the space of hospitality for these different perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense that Margarita, I mean, I'm not Catholic, but I get the sense that Catholics would agree with that. When I read your essay, it feels very all-encompassing, like that it's sort of the reach of Marian dependence and the church has not a totalizing effect, but a sort of universal reach and scope to it. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that where I think Christianity makes, in making the claim at the Enunciation, the meaning of the Enunciation is that God becomes a human being and enters into history, is a unique claim to Christianity. There might be analogies to it in other religions, but the idea that God himself took on flesh and became a person called Jesus Christ is what distinguishes Christianity from other religions. Now, there's a commonality in terms of the sense of a eternal presence, a unifying presence that I think lots of people relate to. I mean, I'm now teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is mostly Protestants. Prior to that, I was at Yale in sociology. And honestly, what got me interested in Mary and Marian devotion was the popular devotions to Mary amongst Italian Americans, or, Robert Orsi's Madonna of 115th Street. And people are moved by the feminine wisdom and by this kind of reverence for women and for the role of mothers in community. And as Jennifer says, in hospitality. And so I think that the students that I teach can both see the universality and the particularity, right? And the universality doesn't mean that there's not a particularity, because then we wouldn't have Buddhists and Hindus and Christians without particularities, right? But there's also something common. But the fact that there's something common doesn't mean that the claim that God himself is a human being and that we can think of ourselves as sons of God is not a really radical idea. It's a really radical idea. And so the work I'm doing now on Mary during my sabbatical here in Oxford is actually trying to look at the mother-son relationship as a way to think about the meaning of Christianity. And I actually want to try to really work through this idea that you can't understand Christianity and you can't practice Christianity without understanding Mary. And that's a claim that unsettles, some Protestants where it's not been that central. And for Catholics where it's kind of like, well, haven't we moved past that? Or, those kinds of old school devotions are sort of like, I don't know, that's what people do when women don't have autonomy and power and education. But yet, look at what's happening with people, all these people going on Marian pilgrimage. This is how I got into it too. Why are all these people who aren't Catholic going on pilgrimage sites? Like what's happening here? And so I'm kind of coming at this through a really and I have Hindu friends and Muslim friends who are very interested in Mary. They may not accept all the theological claims, but they get that there is a supernatural element to Christianity, even if they don't accept all of it. And they think that they can learn from it. So I think that reclaiming the Marian dimension of Christianity is actually a great way to build bridges while holding on to the particularity of Christianity. And there's no way to do that without making Mary really central to the Christian faith again, which is where I think she belongs.
I think of what each of you are saying as subversive in the broader cultural defaults today. But are people hearing them as subversive?
Well, I would say that honestly, in all my years of teaching in sociology and then now in practical theology, there is no topic that has elicited more curiosity and honest questioning and journeying than the class I've taught now twice at Princeton Theological Seminary that I called Ecumenical Devotion to Mary. As a cradle Catholic from, a Cuban background, devotion to Mary is just kind of baked through and through with everything. And went to Catholic school, for 8 years with Marian processions and the rosary. And then myself having not really kept a Marian devotion as I matured and having maybe taken on a sense that Mary's just passive and doesn't have anything to speak to me, a Yale student or a Princeton student or whatever I was. And then moving into a Protestant theological context and actually being asked by my students to kind of explain this kind of Marian devotion to Guadalupe and, that Mary actually is really culturally everywhere. And so when I taught this class, I really expected pushback, really kind of theological arguments. And, the theological arguments did come. We did talk about where is Mary in scripture? And we did talk about, well, what are these Marian doctrines? And do they really belong there? But those conversations were being had with this fundamental openness and curiosity and a desire to really know Mary as a person, not just know Marian theology, but this kind of questioning, like, does Mary belong in my life? And I had students in my class who had their own kind of mystical experiences of Mary that they couldn't explain. And it wasn't being kind of taught to them. And so it's just that you couldn't ignore it any longer. And so, look, all the theological conversations are really important. But my experience has been that people long to encounter Mary as a person. And that's subversive, because certainly in a theological school, we almost want to, maybe people don't know this, but sometimes in a theological school, you distance yourself from the personal and you come at it from this academic sense. And yet, Mother Mary, the Madonna of 115th Street, the Virgin of Guadalupe, she's reaching people. And so there's this honest questioning. And I love Jennifer's work because guess what? People want to talk about motherhood. They want to talk about their experience with their mothers. They want to talk about the experience of giving birth. They want to talk about the experience of losing a child in birth. And so the students I had also just really wanted to talk about the meaning of motherhood, and Mary gives them a chance to do that.
Are you saying we need to ask Mary into our heart, Margarita?
I'm saying she's there with her hands open, the orans posture, and she's bringing God to us and she's inviting us. And are we going to respond to that invitation and let those seeds germinate in our heart?
I'm going to take one detour. My mother, when she was young, she lived on the grounds of a VA hospital, where her father worked. And there was a path in the woods that led to this church. And she was Catholic. And in May was the month of Mary. And every day they would go through the path to the church and go to Mass and celebrate the month of Mary. And her mother was dying when she was young. Her mother had 8 miscarriages and was in poor health and was an alcoholic and was a wonderful, loving mother, but also sick and dying through a lot of her childhood. And I think my own interest in birth always comes back to that image. And I've never been there, but as of this young girl whose mother loved her, who was dying, and who would go to church every day through this path in the woods. And my mother was born in May, so it was also the month of her own birth. And then I was born in June, so it was the month where she was very pregnant with me. So as much as I've, I think, grown away from that, it wasn't what I wrote about in the book. I think those images of Mary were also, in the celebration of Mary, were also kind of part of what nurtured an interest in birth and in life, and birth in the context of death, of what's kind of constantly coming into life and growing, even as other things are passing away. So I wanted to share that in the context of responses. I think that people, at a high level, people are open to the idea of natality. Not everyone. I think some people just really don't want to think about birth. They think that immediately, if you're going there, it's going to be some, political position that they might not agree with, so they're not going to even go there. So I think there's some of that. I also think that there are people who are open to the concept of natality, want to talk about birth, but the moment you get into the particulars, it starts getting, again, very divisive. And you can talk about the Enunciation or you can talk about Mary, but if you start talking about actual people in often more flawed contexts, their stories are full of human error. I found that, we're in a moment of real judgment and, immediately this is a version of birth that I can accept, and this is a version of birth that I can't accept. And I think this is kind of where we are as a culture, is that we haven't found a way to think of these as really all these instances as part of the human story and part of the reality that we're in all instances, in my mind, of of God's creation. So I think that's there. In terms of institutions, I have found that the institutions that have that kind of generative, creative energy, like you said, are tend to be more positive and joyful places. You know, I had one reviewer say that I focus too much on creativity. And this may be partly from publishing Mako Fujimura's work and being so immersed in that and everything that he has shown to me as witness of just how human creativity, artistic creativity, literary, all the different kinds of creativity that we are involved in are really theological, divine acts. And I think we see that, you know, you go into a place that's very creative and it feels very alive. It feels like it's a gift to be alive and to be able to use our talents. And you go into a place that doesn't have that same sort of creative energy. And it can feel like there isn't that same sense of gift or life as something to be celebrated.
Just on that, Jennifer, if I could pull that string a little further, when I think about generative forms of collective life, like communal or organizational life, that seem to have a wisdom around the profundity of human creativity and the spark of the divine in us. As you were writing this book, did you uncover either civilizations or societies, present or past, that seemed more friendly to birth broadly, birth very physically, like literal, like motherhood, giving birth, but also birth as sort of as an emphasis and the right way to view reality?
I think if I can just jump in, I think we could have the month of May, we could start calling it Maytality.
I like that.
My next book.
You heard it here, folks.
I try to be careful about making sweeping generalizations, partly because any kind of generalization is usually off the mark, but also because we really don't have very much information. Throughout history, there's this, instinct to want to think, this other period of time got it right and they had it all better and birth was at the center of everything. But I don't know that that's true. And we don't really have too many ways of knowing it because so much about birth was left off the record. We do have these, often and mostly in religions is where I think it was written about. And then certain philosophers wrote about it a little bit. And then there, we could find, archaeologists or other historians can dig up information about, population patterns and natality rates and different things that hint at what that was like. But I think I've always been haunted by what we don't know. So even though I'm wary of sweeping generalizations, I should say that, in being married to an Indian, I have encountered things that were very different than my own American upbringing. I don't want to make the claim that this culture has it any better than American culture. I think their natality rates used to be high. They have gone down in some ways. Certain patterns are probably fairly similar to the US right now. But it is a culture that, for instance, when we were married, I said, are we having children to the wedding? And he was horrified, and I, of course, wanted children at the wedding too. Wherever I went, my family always had children. We were never excluded, but you go to weddings in America and, it's adults. And that is a culture in many other cultures where that would never be the case. Part of human community includes children as an integral part, which doesn't mean that everyone has to have them or that it's the only way to fulfill one's life path, but that they are part of being in community. And, it's just incredibly populated country. When we have visited there, it's an experience of real intimacy, of being surrounded, which for me is also the experience of motherhood is, you constantly have these people in your space. It's you don't have that kind of personal space and distance from other bodies that you have as a American. So I mean,
so just to be clear, can I ask a clarifying question? Mm-hmm. You were saying he was horrified that anybody would even think about not inviting kids to weddings?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, it's partly that it's fun to have them and they should just be there. It's also part of, the marriage is about witnessing, and the community is an important part of the ritual, because they are, they're going to grow up and remember when you were married, and they're going to hold you to your vows. And it's important to have that next generation there. The last thing I was going to say is that I think that birth rates are closely correlated with wealth. And, as wealth goes up in a culture, by and large, birth rates go down. It's not like completely and neatly correlated. But I think in some cultures where there isn't the same kind of wealth, you don't have the big houses with everyone in their separate bedroom. You don't have the big cars where you're kind of buffered from the rest of the world, where some of that intimacy, that experience of just physical closeness is more part of one's daily reality.
This actually goes back to your comment that opened up this podcast. I sometimes, because I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, it's a chance for me to invite students to, let's just step out of our modern context for a moment. And with regards to the subject that I've written about for your magazine on Mary, I encourage students to read on women mystics and their visions of Mary. Julian of Norwich, for example, comes to mind. Also, I think, St. Teresa of Avila's writings on Mary. But, there's a sense in which these women mystics were identifying very much with the bodily motherhood of Mary. But again, also with this kind of mystical understanding of our femininity and the gift of our body being completed by participating in this divine fugue, in this divine story. So what I think is so hard about modern conversations around gender is that there's a need for self-expression or discovery of gender, or a kind of social role. And we've kind of missed this whole point that there's a participation in something that unifies us, and that sexual differentiation is a reflection, actually, of a fugue, of a resonance and a harmony with something that transcends us but pulls us together. And I know that sounds like a whole lot of words, but I think that there's a real wisdom in how people thought about femininity and the feminine body in a both natural and a mystical sense that you can find in medieval women mystics.
Yeah, I think some of our greatest resources for thinking through these questions are certainly within religious traditions, partly because I think that these traditions put all questions about human identity in relation to something much larger. I think there is a tendency in our culture right now to have gender carry so much meaning. And this is on all sides of the issues. And, I think part of what you get in many traditions, particularly I feel like in some of the early sources we have, maybe this isn't always true, but the sources that I think have been the most powerful in the traditions that people have continually turned back to, they imagine very often a God that isn't really necessarily gendered. I mean, part of what's powerful about Julian of Norwich isn't just that she wrote about Marian, but she actually writes about God as a birthing mother. And kind of it flips and it's fluid and it's changeable. In a way, these are all just metaphors that we're trying to use to describe something that is beyond our human language, beyond human metaphors, so, that they will never be completely neatly contained by them. I turn back a lot to this quote from Rilke, who was heavily influenced by Christianity, but also wrote something like this. He writes, "And perhaps the sexes are more related than we think, and the great renewal of the world will perhaps consist in this, that man and maid, freed of all false feelings and reluctances, will seek each other, not as opposites, but as brother and sister, as neighbors, and will come together as human beings in order simply, seriously, and patiently to bear in common the difficult sex that has been laid upon them.
That was Rilke.
That's Rilke, yeah. That's in Letters to a Young Poet.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Of course, we've all been born, so we all have sort of natality embedded in our experience, whether we remember it or not. But mothers have this very intimate experience of it in their own body. So the Marian contemplation of treasuring these things up in her heart, the events of the Nativity and the Enunciation, mothers can kind of see that and experience that I think in a special way. But how would both of you say men could enter into that? Well, like, what are strategies for thinking about that as somebody who doesn't have that experience but is seeking to contemplate natality or contemplate, the motherhood of Mary more deeply?
Well, I'll just speak, Jeff, to the direction I'm going with my own work right now, which I mentioned earlier, is thinking about the mother-son relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the little bit of work I've been doing on that and some of the reading I've been doing, this book I was reading even today by Louis Boyer on Mary, the Throne of Wisdom. Thinking about, as you mentioned, we all know that we were born, that we came out of the womb of a woman. And I think thinking about the mother-son relationship helps think about how we turn back as well to our mothers as a sign of hope. I mean, one of the most moving things somebody said to me that he took my class on ecumenical devotion to Mary. He was a military chaplain, served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. And he said, taking this class on Mary because soldiers dying on the battlefield call out to their mothers. And I wonder if, the mother of Jesus can help me as I bring their bodies back to their earthly mothers in a casket. So this idea of kind of, these macho, masculine men, soldiers, warriors, who their dying thought is for their mother. That really stayed with me. And it's kind of a hopeful cry, right? It's like a desire. I could go on, but I'll just stop with that. So I think that absolutely men participate in birth and they participate in motherhood, but as sons. And I don't want to lose the son-mother relationship and think about this kind of turning back to mothers as a kind of hope for the future. And then the supernatural meaning of the redemption, right? There's always a possibility. Yes, we're born at a moment in time. We absolutely don't want to forget that. But that with divine grace, there's always possibility of redemption. And the mother-son relationship is a channel of that grace pulling back towards divine redemption.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about in your essay as Mary being somebody who knows how to read signs. And every son's participation in motherhood is sort of a sign of that kind of universal motherhood. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, to the extent that everybody participates in being a child, right?
Yeah.
And that the mother of God, the mother-son relationship, and even when the son grows up to be in some ways worldly, more powerful than the mother, there's still this primordial relationship that is actually what gives meaning and hope and direction. And so that's one way of thinking of it, I would say.
I mean, I think one of the goals of my book, whether I succeeded or not, I don't know, but was to try to open the topic of birth up to men. I think that there's something about giving it its due as a topic that is completely entangled with the history of women is important, because there's a whole history of kind of taking birth and abstracting it and men using it as a concept without really attending to the reality, the kind of embodied reality. And so that is important to kind of root it in specific histories, in the history of women, in motherhood. But I think, where does that leave us in kind of refusing of guarding this experience? I think that, what we see in our culture is that people are actually fine to leave birth to women, and then they have to kind of work it out for themselves, and they're on their own, and they don't have a maternity leave, and they don't have prenatal care, and they're on their own with birth. It's all theirs, So I really think that if we want birth to be something that is more integrated into our lives and our cultures and our stories, we have to have men be part of that. This is part of their own histories. This is also something that is constantly shaping the cultures they're in, their families, their communities. And, you think about something like death. There are places where men can go and talk about death. They can go to groups for grieving, people who are grieving the loss of someone. They can go to these death cafes that are throughout the world where people just, it's like a death meetup where you go and just talk about death. You don't have to have died, of course, because no one has died. So nobody there has had the experience. They have witnessed it. And we also are witnesses to birth. So why does that not give us access to these conversations? I, as a mother, as a daughter, as a sister, I have actually a lot of people I can talk about birth with. I spend a lot of time with mothers, and these are often, kind of private conversations. I talk about them, mothers share their birth stories the way that veterans share their war stories. It's kind of, it comes right out, and but you don't talk about that in certain company. And for a man, where would you go to have those conversations? I don't know. I think that men in some ways are worse off because they have kind of no entry into those conversations. So I think it's challenging of finding a way to say that this has been the history of women. Women have been at the heart of this experience, and yet this is a part of our shared culture.
Well, from both of your lips to the broader audience, both of us are so grateful for each of you naming something that is at once very universal and, well, in Natality's case, timeless, in the Marian case, historical, but with universal implications. I'm very interested to see how, frankly, the coming generations pick up both these topics, because I think there's a deep hunger for two major things broadly. One is a desire for permission to be constructive, and growing hunger for interdependence. What is it to be an agent while also participating in a action that has gone before me? I think something about each of these concepts are in the water already, and I see it in young people. I see it in our readers. I certainly know it in my own soul. So I just want to thank both of you for your work. We look forward to accompanying each of you and incarnating them in words and real lives from here.
Thank you so much for having us. It was great to be in dialogue with you all.
Yes, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. Comment's mission is to foster imagination for a thriving society. We publish pieces by cultural luminaries and pioneering practitioners. We produce this podcast and another, arguably still feistier one, called Zealots at the Gate. We equip and convene civic leaders through suppers and other gatherings all around North America, and we are stewarding a budding institutional ecosystem animated by the Christian humanist tradition, an ecosystem known as Breaking Ground. Comment readers are society's weavers, those community shepherds laboring to hold our social fabric together. And our job in all that we do is to help them, really help you, rehumanize our age, equipping you with frameworks, stories, and exemplars to sustain your vocational joy, refresh your vision, and connect you with one another to effect real cultural change. Consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or attend one of our webinars with an author. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder.
And I'm Jeff Reimer.
And we'll see you next week.